Do you have to track calories to lose weight? Absolutely, the answer is no. I have worked with many clients who do not have to track calories or macros in order to lose weight. And in this video, I'm going to dive into the behind the scenes processes that are happening when you lose weight or when you lose fat, and how you can create that experience without tracking calories or macros if, for whatever reason, working with numbers isn't right for you as an individual. First, let's talk about what weight loss really is. It is created by a caloric deficit, which means that what you're bringing in calorie-wise has to be less than what you are putting out in terms of energy. And the calorie deficit, it really matters how big it is, because if it's too big, that's often when people burn out and implode on a diet. And if it's too small, it can be so close to maintenance that people end up eating at maintenance calories anyway on many days. So they're kind of accidentally edging back out of that caloric deficit into maintenance calories, and they're not losing any weight either. So you want to be somewhere between those two extremes. On the one hand, people who are burning out because the diets are too strict, the calories are too low. And on the other hand, you're not even in a deficit at all because it's so close to maintenance, it's too easy to mess up. So what we're looking for is the Goldilocks size deficit, where it's just enough that you are losing weight, you're losing it at a pace that's appreciable, and that can be whether we're talking about actual scale pounds dropped or the changes in body composition that would tell you that you're losing fat. So clothes are fitting better, that dress is zipping up easier. These are all things that would tell you that you're losing fat, even if the number on the scale isn't shifting that much. And usually when it comes to a caloric deficit, our bodies actually respond the best to weight loss or to fat loss if the number is just big enough to lose weight and not a lot bigger than that. So your body does send up more red flags if you're using a huge caloric deficit, which is partly why people burn out when they diet too strictly. So when someone is using numbers to track, they're just quantifying their actions. They're not actually doing something different. They're just quantifying what they're doing with a relative degree of accuracy. The reality is, even if you don't use numbers though, you can do the exact same behavioral changes that someone is doing who's tracking. Whether the person is tracking calories, macros, or both, even if you don't track any of that, you can create a lot of the same behavior modifications just through changing your habits, even if you're not totally sure what the numbers are. So I want to talk about some of the pros and cons of tracking versus not tracking. So one of the advantages of tracking calories and macros is that it's relatively accurate. And I'll explain in a minute more what I mean by relatively, but essentially you are working with reality. You are probably pretty close on most of the numbers, assuming that you're tracking with some skill, and you know how big your deficit is and you know what you're eating most days. Another advantage of tracking calories is if your lifestyle is somewhat inconsistent. So let's say you have a lot of business travel. Even though it can seem like it would be super challenging to track calories under those circumstances, I've actually found with some clients that, let's take vacations off the table, and let's just say it's a really busy lifestyle with a lot of disruption. It helps people be more honest about what they're eating and to be more self-insightful about, oh, I did actually, that did count as breakfast on the plane when I ate that, just because I'm in a new place and I'm bored doesn't mean that a second breakfast doesn't count. I think it helps people be more aware of how much they're actually eating whenever their lives aren't in a really regular, predictable rhythm. Another major advantage of calorie tracking, and I should add macro tracking in this case, is for me helping women to eat enough protein. Because even if you don't use something like MyFitnessPal and you only just go by meal numbers, it can really help women know whether they're eating 10 grams of protein per meal or 30 grams of protein per meal. And when it comes to fitness and improving body composition, we do want protein to be on the higher end. And sometimes without using numbers, that can be tricky for women because they're never seeing the value of each thing that they're eating, kind of like in a dollars and cents way. So what would be best for them would be to eat more than 100 grams of protein a day. Without actually using numbers, sometimes they would never hit that 100. It doesn't mean that they need to track protein every day of their lives for the rest of their lives, but it does help them kind of boot camp their way into eating more and having more awareness of their actual protein intake. Finally, another huge advantage of tracking calories and macros is that counterintuitively, it can actually prevent undereating. And this is something that I've personally experienced as well as with many of my clients, which is that when you're an active person, like a really active, hardworking workout person, you can undershoot how much you need to be eating on a daily basis. And of course, it's easy to overshoot it if you're, eating out all the time. But if you cook mostly at home and you're a health conscious eater, it's very easy to be exercising at an intense level and then underfueling. So sometimes for some women, it can be really advantageous for them to be hitting more like 2,100, 2,500, 2,800 calories a day, especially on training days. And if you're not actually tracking and you're very health conscious and you've absorbed messages for a long time about moving more and eating less, you may actually be eating less, like way less than you should be. So tracking can help correct that, help you fuel appropriately for your exercise lifestyle, for how much muscle you have, how much muscle you want to have, in a way that really promotes healthy hormone balance for women and avoids things like overtraining syndrome, relative energy deficiency, low energy availability, all of those, kind of scary sounding acronyms that we want to avoid. Now, I've painted a picture of calorie tracking that seems really flattering, like why wouldn't we track calories? And the reality is there are many, many reasons, and I'm going to start with the very first, most obvious one. First of all, if you have struggled with a diagnosed eating disorder, or you just know that you have really struggled with disordered eating, probably a full calorie and macro tracking plan is not going to be advantageous for you. It's possible that the risk is just too high, that it's going to trigger disordered thinking, disordered eating, and distort your relationship with your body, with exercise, and with food. And anytime we're making decisions about exercise, nutrition, and how it relates to health, health always wins. So if the risk of triggering something is higher than the possible slight benefits that something would have, let's say calorie tracking would give you a slight edge in terms of precision and self-awareness, it's probably not worth it if it triggers something much bigger and much worse. So if you have struggled with an eating disorder or disordered eating, it may not be the right choice for you, and you should definitely talk with your healthcare professional and your mental health care professional before making a decision about it. Secondly, calorie tracking is maybe just not that practical for people who have really repetitive lifestyles. If you mainly cook and eat all of your food at home, and it's almost the same every day, and I'm saying same as in a template, your daily routine is very regular, calorie tracking may not be very beneficial for you because it's not really changing that much. So let's say you track one day and you're eating X amount of calories, this much protein, maybe that would give you some inspiration to change some of the food quality or, try to get more protein in or something like that. But it's probably not going to help govern your behavior all that much if your behavior is kind of in a set pattern anyway. Another big disadvantage of calorie tracking that a lot of people don't realize before they get into it, and sometimes they're not even realizing it when they're doing it, is that calorie tracking is a skill in itself. And it's a separate skill from the behavior modifications that would lead to weight loss. And I think people assume when they track calories that it's going to be easy, I'm going to track everything I eat, I'm going to be really precise, I'm going to be really honest with myself. And they may actually do all of those things, but then get really frustrated because calorie tracking is kind of hard, especially if you eat out, you do social things with friends, someone else cooks a meal for you. It's real life stuff that's going to trip you up. It doesn't mean that you're like sitting on your couch with a gallon of Ben and Jerry's, because you could track that. Like, it has a label and it's really clear. It's more like you go to a friend's house and they baked a quiche and you're looking at it and going, I have no idea what's in that. And then what do? Like, do you get the recipe from them, or do you just search in MyFitnessPal like for some kind of generic quiche? It can be really tricky, especially if, if you come from a more perfectionist mindset and you're trying to do it exactly right. It can be an extremely short-circuiting experience because there's so much real life that's going to get in the way of tracking perfectly accurately. And getting good at using MyFitnessPal is a skill in itself, where you learn how to manage it, which foods you're going to track accurately, which foods you're going to let go of. That is a skill that you build. And sometimes when people have limited bandwidth, like you're really busy with work, you're really busy with kids, you may not have the leftover bandwidth to also master this app, where you could probably have the bandwidth to master some behavioral strategies that actually would, ironically, get you in a calorie deficit and losing weight right away. So you have to be really aware of how much time and energy do I have to expend to learn something new that could potentially be complicated. And then finally, this is what I was talking about, it being relatively accurate, is that by nature, calorie tracking is somewhat inaccurate. It is relatively accurate, but it's not perfect. And what I mean by that is that food labels are allowed a standard amount of deviation in terms of calories being perfectly right. So that means that what you're seeing on a label might be a little off. And that's also why sometimes if you track, your calories and your macros aren't lining up perfectly, even though technically they should. Like if you total up all of your macros and you do the math right, it should equal the calories, but you're gonna find that it often doesn't, which is super weird. And this can be because of inconsistencies in labeling, even within one product. Like one package could say, it has 8 grams of protein, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe it has 7.6, but then maybe it really has 140 calories, but they were able to round down to 130. They are allowed a certain amount of variation that's incorrect. So it's not going to be perfectly accurate, even if you are immensely scientifically accurate in how you attempt to track. Then take that and layer on the fact that we are just not very accurate as people. In terms of, are you literally scooping out peanut butter and leveling off the spoon every time you have peanut butter? And then are you tracking it accurately in that way? Are you measuring everything you eat? And it really becomes a question of how much do you want your eating to change based on tracking versus how much do you just want your eating to change in order to improve your lifestyle and elicit the results that you want? And that's where tracking, it's important to remember that it's like a map. If you're driving, you do not stare at the map the entire time. You consult the map whenever you're not sure what's going on. And that is actually a really great way to use calorie tracking, is because it's not perfectly accurate, to just get broad views of things. Like, okay, basically, how much is this? So anytime we use a tool, it's very important to distinguish between, am I using a tool or am I actually building a skill? And most of the time, what I want people to do is use tools in a smart way, but really build skills. We actually want to change your eating habits. We want to improve your eating quality. And there are certain things that apps like MyFitnessPal just can't do for you. They can't improve your eating quality. It won't make sure for you that you're setting up really satisfying meal composition with each meal that helps to beat cravings and eliminate extra snacking and eliminate foraging, those kinds of behaviors. So we really want to zoom out and look at food behaviors instead of thinking that tracking is going to be your savior. It's not going to fix your problems, but it is a really useful tool if you use it intentionally, use it consistently, and use it well. But then what I like for clients to do is to not have to use it all the time. And for some clients, not at all. Because what's really important is what you're really doing, not what you're tracking.